of cell theory. It comes in three parts. All living things are made of cells. The cell is the basic unit of structure and function for all living things. And number three, all cells come from other cells, from pre existing cells. We then move into the cells themselves. We talk about how there's two very broad categories of cells. There are the prokaryotes and the eukaryotes. We know that the prokaryotes do not have nucleuses, they do not have membrane bound organelles. They are pretty simple and kind of small. We look at the eukaryotic cells, and the eukaryotic cells do have a nucleus. Eukaryotic cells do have membrane bound organelles. Eukaryotic cells are larger, eukaryotic cells are a little more complex. And this complexity we can look at by looking at the different organelles. So we started looking at some of the organelles yesterday, and we are still looking at organelles today. So we are going to start with ribosomes. Now, ribosomes, by the way, I would like to say these organelles appear in both prokaryotic cells, they appear in eukaryotic cells, they appear in plant cells. All cells have ribosomes. And the reason why all cells have ribosomes is because ribosomes are where we synthesize proteins. The word synthesize proteins is another fancy schmancy way of saying this is where we build our proteins. We build the proteins using the instructions that are in our DNA. Remember DNA? Instructions for everything. Every single cell, I don't care, prokaryotic, eukaryotic, plant, animal, fungus, bacteria, archaea, it doesn't matter. If it is a cell, it has a ribosome. At least one, usually a lot more than one. And again, it's because these perform protein synthesis. We know that protein is one of our four macromolecules, and those four macromolecules are the building blocks of life. Without proteins, we really don't have too many chemical reactions, and that's sort of the stuff that powers life, if you will. What a ribosome literally does is they link together our amino acids to make the polypeptide chain. So on the ribosome, that is the place where that dehydration synthesis occurs. This is where we actually put together the amino acids and start to build up our proteins. And again, ribosomes, we can find these in every single type of cell. It does not matter what kind of cell it is. Now, the next one that we have is the endoplasmic reticulum. There are two types of endoplasmic reticulum. There is smooth ER and then there is rough ER. And we'll get into that in a minute. Endoplasmic reticulum is found only in eukaryotic cells. So this is a membrane bound organelle. It is only found in the eukaryotic cells. It is a system that helps to assemble lipids and also it helps with proteins and other materials that are exported from the cell. And as you can see in the diagram, the reason why we only find these in eukaryotic cells is because they tend to be anchored to the nucleus. Obviously, we know that prokaryotic cells do not have a nucleus, so they do not have endoplasmic reticulum either. Because again, the rough ER is anchored to the nucleus. If you don't have a nucleus, you don't have anywhere to anchor your ER. By the way, very rarely do biologists actually refer to the endoplasmic reticulum as the endoplasmic reticulum because that is a mouthful. More often than not, we will just call it the ER, not to be confused with the emergency room. All right, so again, two types of ER. We have the rough ER, and it's called rough because there are little tiny itty bitty ribosomes that kind of dot the surface, okay? And if you were to like look at it, it literally is all bumpy, so it's rough. So that's actually one of those like vocabulary words in science that makes sense. I kind of like that. Again, as we already figured out that the ribosomes build proteins, when we have these ribosomes attached to the rough ER, basically what we're doing is we are creating channels by which to transport proteins and to modify proteins in the rough ER. So you remember when we talked about the building of proteins, how we had the peptide chains, but then those peptide chains had to be folded in certain ways, and there was tertiary and quaternary proteins depending on how many proteins and what kind of folds they got. This is where that folding is happening. The smooth ER, just like the name suggests, is not covered in ribosomes. It's nice and smooth. Hence the name, smooth ER. Um, so if the rough ER mostly is about protein, then the smooth ER is mostly about lipids. Okay, so a lot of the fats, um, lipid synthesis happens here and the smooth ER. Also, super important, ladies and gentlemen, we do a lot of detoxification functions with smooth ER. Your liver is the largest organ in your body that does detoxification. So it's no surprise that if we were to look at liver cells under a microscope, we see that liver cells have a ton of smooth ER, because remember we talked about specialized cells. The function of the liver in your body, in my body, in any mammal's body, is to detoxify the blood and the system. Also, side note, this is why we find people who have addiction problems, whether it's drugs or alcohol. We see them with a lot of liver damage because their liver really is being constantly used to detoxify the system. All right, next we have the Golgi apparatus. I love that name. I don't know why; it just sounds really cool. The Golgi apparatus will it's kind of like a packaging center. Like the Golgi apparatus is almost like the postage like the post office, if you will, in the cell. It will change, sort, package, and send other materials. So from the ER to anywhere else that needs to be in the cell, or even to get things out of the cell. So the Golgi apparatus pretty much acts like a packaging and shipment center. So I always thought of it kind of as being like the post office of the cell. Again, the purpose of the Golgi apparatus is to modify, sort, and package proteins and other materials. So again, it's literally like the shipping center. Sometimes you will see, depending on the textbook, depending on the website, you will see the Golgi apparatus talked about as a Golgi body, just so that you are aware it's the same thing. It's like tomato, tomato, Golgi apparatus, Golgi body. They're talking about the same thing. Whether it's referred to as the Golgi body or the Golgi apparatus really is a function of how old or the person that put together the material is. Somebody in my age group is more likely to call it a Golgi body as a general rule because that's how I learned it back in school. Over the last, I don't know, 30, 40 years, whatever it's been, 30 years since I've graduated high school, as they've found out more about what the Golgi apparatus does, they have sort of tweaked the name. But it means the same thing, and you will find it described both ways in various different resources. So I just want you to be aware of that. They're not talking about two different things. Golgi apparatus, Golgi body, same thing. And of course, this is a membrane bound organelle, so we're only going to find this in our eukaryotic cells. Okay, mitochondria. The mighty mitochondria. Mitochondrias are the powerhouse of the cell. So if the Golgi apparatus is like, if we think of our cell like a city, if the Golgi apparatus is sort of the post office, then the mitochondria is the power generator. Okay? The function of the mitochondria is to convert chemical energy that is stored in the food that you eat into actual energy that your cell can use a lot easier. The fuel for our cells is a molecule called ATP, adenosine triphosphate, for those of you that are, super nerds like myself. And that ATP, or adenosine triphosphate, is used to perform cellular respiration. It is used to pretty much power every energy need in a cell. Now, eukaryotic cells all usually have mitochondria. The more energy that cell might need, the more mitochondria it is going to have. For example, your muscle cells have way more mitochondria than, for example, I'm just trying to think, maybe like a red blood cell. Okay? Because your muscle cells obviously require way more energy because they have to move and contract and expand to move your body versus like your red blood cells, which literally get pumped around and they don't have to move on their own. So, like we said, depending on the specialization of the cell, you will see different organelles. So, we do tend to see a lot more mitochondria in muscle cells. Mitochondrion, which is weird. It's like one of those like Latin things, is the singular. And again, we often find this. We also call it the powerhouse of the cell. But again, it is a double membraned organelle. So again, if it's a membrane bound organelle, we're only going to find these in our eukaryotic cells. Okay, the chloroplast. This is found only in plant cells, really. Chloroplasts are found in the cells of plants and some other photosynthetic organisms. So there are some bacteria that do photosynthesis, but by and large, chloroplasts are found primarily in plant cells. The function of a chloroplast, it's kind of like a solar panel, if you want to think of it that way. It will literally take energy from the sun and then water and carbon dioxide, and it turns all of that into glucose. And we know from our macromolecules that glucose is used for energy, right? Like this is like the basic unit of quick energy for all living things. Well, it all pretty much comes ultimately from photosynthesis. So this is a huge evolutionary advantage because again, plants use chloroplasts to make glucose, and then animals and other organisms consume the plants, and that's where we ultimately get our energy from. And you might be like, but I only like to eat beef, and that's great, except for that cow ate grass, and the grass got the energy from the chloroplast. So it all goes down to the sun energy ultimately. But again, we already know that, like glucose, we know is a source of energy. We studied that when we looked at our macromolecules. Again, a chloroplast is a membrane bound organelle, so we're only going to find it in eukaryotic cells. Again, mostly in plant cells, but there are a few bacteria, there are a few algae, there are a few single cell organisms that also do photosynthesis. Usually they are found in aquatic environments. All right. Second to last one that we need to do here, ladies and gentlemen, the cell membrane. So all cells have a cell membrane. Prokaryotics, eukaryotics, plant, animal, I don't care. Every single cell on the planet has a cell membrane. Sometimes we call the cell membrane a plasma membrane. Again, that is all about like who's teaching it, but if you see plasma membrane, if you see cell membrane, it's the same thing. I don't know why we have two words for the same thing, but it's kind of like Golgi body, Golgi apparatus. It's just all about like the age of the person talking about it. We already know that this cell membrane is a bilayer. It's a phospholipid. It's a phospholipid bilayer. We talked about this when we talked about the macromolecules. So we know that when we have these lipids, they make this cell membrane. And what it does, because these phospholipids are polar, remember polar meaning they have a slight charge on one side, slight charge on the other side, it will regulate what enters and what leaves the cell. This means that our cell membrane is responsible because again, it says, nah, you can't come in. Oh, okay, you can, or hey, you can leave, but you can't. What it's doing there is it's helping to maintain homeostasis. So the cell membrane helps to maintain homeostasis by regulating what enters and what exits the cell. This also provides protection and it also provides support. And if you look here at the bottom, you can see these little tiny dots with sort of these tails. Those are our lipids. Remember, the lipids always had tails on them. And then there's other things happening on the cell membrane, but we'll get more into detail in our cell membrane next week. All right, lastly, the cell wall. Cell wall is found in many, many, many prokaryotes. Um, we can find it in plant cells, we can find it in fungal cells, and algae cells. So, a cell wall is a very, very strong supportive outer layer for a cell. It helps to shape, it helps to protect, and it creates a barrier for this cell. Um, so, the stuff that we call wood is primarily cell walls. So, cell wall is a very strong cellulose material. It's basically wood fiber. Um, and those cells, even when they are no longer living, like like your wood furniture, still retain a lot of that strength, a lot of that support, a lot of that that same shape, which is how why we use wood for a building material. This is not exclusive to prokaryotes or eukaryotes. Both prokaryotes and eukaryotes can have a cell wall, but not all do have a cell wall. All right, so the last thing I want to talk about is the differences between plant cells and animal cells. And then after that, ladies and gentlemen, there are a few questions that follow that you will be able to work on your own. Um, so, like I said, this is the last official part of the notes in terms of the thing that you're going to be copying, because and then I think there are 8 comprehension questions after this. So, we talked about the difference between prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. Great. I now want to talk a little bit about plant cells versus animal cells. Keeping in mind, both plant and animal cells are eukaryotic cells. They both have nucleuses. So, in the center of this Venn diagram, we see that plant animal cells both have DNA, both have a cell membrane, both have a nucleus, both have ribosomes, and both have endoplasmic reticulum. By the way, that it would be both smooth and rough ER. So, how are they different? Okay, well, an animal cell does not have a cell wall. A plant cell does have a cell wall. Animal cells have very, very small individual vacuoles. Remember, those vacuoles are just kind of like your little storage compartments. In a plant cell, we have a very large central vacuole. So we don't have a bunch of little tiny itty bitty ones. We have one really big central vacuole. In terms of shapes, animal cells tend to be irregularly shaped in the sense that they are going to take the shape and they're going to look like the thing that they do. As a general rule, not 100% of the time, but generally speaking, plant uh, plant cells tend to have a more regular, rectangular, square like shape. Not always, but often. And then, as far as organelles, animal cells have centrioles. Remember, those centrioles are going to help with cell division. And plant cells all have cell walls. Oh, and by the way, they also have chloroplasts. So plant cells have cell walls and chloroplasts. Those are unique um, organelles that only belong to plant cells. And as far as the animal cells are concerned, we see centrioles present. Okay, so these are the big differences, if you will, between plant and animal cells. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the notes here.